In this video, we're going to learn more about angiosperms. So let's take a look at a quick review of plant evolution and the timeline when all this happened. So remember that about 500 million years ago, and remember MYA means millions of years ago. So 500 million years ago, I guess not the S. That's when the seedless non-vascular plants first evolved. And so these are the bryophytes that we've talked about previously. About 425 million years ago, we got the seedless vascular plants, which were things like the ferns. About 400 million years ago, the first seed-producing vascular plants evolved, and these are the gymnosperms that we've talked about in some previous videos. And then about 125 million years ago, so fairly recent in the grand scheme of things, is when we started to see angiosperms show up in the fossil record. And the key thing with angiosperms is that they produce flowers. So they are seeded, so they do produce seeds. They are vascular, but the kind of the defining feature is that they produce flowers. And then about 25 million years later, so about 100 million years ago, there was an increased diversification of angiosperms. And it's interesting because in the fossil record, there's also an increased kind of evolution and diversity of insects. And it's possible that the angiosperms and the insects were co-evolving because insects work as pollinators in order to help angiosperms with sexual reproduction. Now, based on analyses, it is believed that the angiosperms did not evolve from the gymnosperms. So it's possible that they had a kind of a common ancestor back in the day, but then they kind of evolved along two different pathways. So as we mentioned, one of the key features of angiosperms is that they produce flowers. And the flower is what contains the male and or female reproductive structures. And I said and or because some flowers contain both, whereas some contain one or the other. There are male organs that produce male gametes, which are sperm, and that sperm is packaged in this structure called pollen, which provides it with some protection. There are female organs that produce female gametes, which are eggs, and they're protected by an ovule in a structure called an ovary. Similar to gymnosperms, fertilization and embryonic development occurs in a protective structure. And so this is kind of a key difference between seedless plants and plants that produce seeds, and that the seeds and the kind of developing ovary are protected. So this allows those seeds to potentially go dormant for a long period of time in order to wait for conditions to be optimal for growth. It also allows seeds to be able to be spread over longer distances. So the term angiosperm means seed in a vessel. And so that vessel is just the thing that is protecting the seed. And we're going to talk about that vessel being a fruit. So remember that in plants, we have this alternation of generations. And so we have a sporophyte generation, and then we have a gametophyte generation. But remember, in these plants with seeds, the gametophyte is dependent on the sporophyte. So the gametophyte structure is actually inside the flower. So the flower and the stem and the leaves, that all makes up the sporophyte. And then the reproductive structures that are typically in the middle of the flower are the gametophyte structures. Now, the female gametophyte is called an ovule, and it develops into a seed after the sperm fertilizes the egg. And we're going to talk more about the details of this on some other slides and videos. Now, the ovary, so the the ovule, and then the ovary surrounds the ovule. So when that ovule turns into a seed, the ovary is ultimately going to turn into fruit. And this fruit is going to help to protect the seed, but also aid in dispersal. And that's because the fruit can be potentially, it can be sticky, so it might stick to an animal and be carried somewhere else. The fruit might be tasty, so an animal might eat it and then either drop the seeds somewhere, or the seeds might pass through the digestive tract and come out in the feces and then be planted wherever they land. Sometimes the fruit is lightweight and it can allow the seed to float on water. And then sometimes the seeds are really light and they can actually be transported in the air. So as a reminder, angiosperms are the flowering plants. There are over 300,000 species of angiosperms. These are the most kind of dominant plants that you see when you're just out and about walking around. So angiosperms are the most prevalent and kind of the most dominant plants that you see. They're very diverse in structure and habitat, so they take lots of different shapes and sizes, and they exist in pretty much every ecosystem around the world. And one reason why they are able to live in these different habitats and why they are so diverse and so prominent is that they do have an evolutionary advantage due to the production of flowers, and I guess I should put seeds in here as well, and fruit. So we're going to take a closer look at kind of the structure of a flower and kind of what's in the middle of that flower. So the flower is designed to really protect the gametophytes, so protecting the male and female reproductive structures. And then it also helps to protect the developing embryo until the fruit forms around it. Flowers also help with pollination. So pollination just refers to the transfer of pollen from one plant to another. And so this often happens through the help of insects, which we call pollinators. And so if you think about it, a bee can be seen maybe hanging out, drinking the nectar in the from the flower, and as it's in there drinking the nectar, the pollen gets stuck to the bee's body. And then when the bee moves on to another flower and drinks its nectar, some of that pollen is going to get left behind and it's going to stick to the other plant. And ultimately, that pollination occurred, and then ultimately fertilization might occur. So different flowers have different colors, and different insects are attracted to different colors. They also have some different patterns, and some of these patterns are only visible in UV light. So UV is ultraviolet. And humans cannot see in this wavelength of light. So we don't have the correct sensory receptors to be able to detect this kind of range of radiation. But a lot of insects can. So this picture on the right is showing a strawberry flower, and the top is what we would just call the visual light spectrum. And so this is what we as humans see. But the lower picture, this is what this flower would look like to an insect under UV light. And so you can see that it looks different. We've got some like higher contrast. The bees and the other insects can also see the veining and the petals better. And so they have specialized sensory structures that can pick up these wavelengths of light that humans can't see. Different flowers also give off different scents, and different insects are evolved to be attracted to different scents. So things like bees, butterflies, and moths are attracted to sweet smelling flowers. And then things like flies and beetles are actually attracted to flowers that smell like they're fermenting, so kind of rotting, alcoholic smell, or putrefaction. So basically, something that smells like death. Now let's take a look at the anatomy of a flower. So the peduncle is what attaches the flower to the rest of the plant. And I apologize that this overlapped the T in plant. And so that is going to be the structure down here. The calyx is a whorl of sepals at the base of the peduncle. So the sepals are these kind of leaf-like structures here. And then both of them together, or all of them together, because this is, two-dimensional drawing, but there would be multiple of these sepals surrounding the base of the flower. All together, it's known as the calyx. The petals are these colorful structures here, and all of them together, kind of this whole area of petals, is known as the corolla. And the perianth makes up the sepals and the petals together. So essentially, this whole region here would be referred to as the perianth. The sexual organs, which are ultimately going to be making the gametophytes and then also making the seed, are located inside the flower. And as you recall, there are separate male and female parts. The female structure altogether is called the gynoecium. And think of gyno, think of gynecologist. The male structure is known as the androecium. And if you think of andro, you can think of things like androgens, which are the male sex hormones. All right, so andro kind of refers to male things, gyno kind of refers to female things. So a female doctor is a gynecologist. The female sex organ is also called a carpel. And the male sex organ is also called a stamen. Let's take a closer look at the gynoecium, which remember is also called a carpel. So this whole structure here is a carpel, and it consists of a stigma. And the stigma is where pollination occurs. And that's going to be at the kind of the top part here. And it is sticky. That stickiness allows or helps pollen to actually stick to the carpel. The style is this area here. And after pollen lands on the stigma, it is ultimately going to form a pollen tube that goes through the style. So there's going to be a pollen tube that kind of goes down. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the process of pollination. This area down here is the ovary. And within the ovary, there are multiple ovules. So each one of these kind of smaller little bumps here is an ovule. And the ovule is also known as the megasporangium. And the ovule is also referred to as the megasporangium. And a megasporangium or a sporangium is just a structure that produces spores. Each one of these ovules will ultimately develop into a seed, and then the ovary itself is ultimately going to form a fruit. Now, in some flowers, there might be multiple carpels. And remember, the carpel is this whole structure here. There might be multiple carpels that are actually fused together to kind of form one big carpel. And when that's the case, the multiple carpels together is called a pistil. Now let's take a closer look at the androecium, which remember is also known as the stamen. And this is the male structure that is ultimately going to produce male spores and pollen. So typically, if you were to look at a flower, so if we were looking kind of from the top down at a flower, the carpel is usually right in the middle. And then the stamen are kind of sticking up and out around the carpel. Each stamen consists of a filament, and the filament is just this stalk right here. It also consists of an anther, which is kind of this whole structure here. And the anther consists of these kind of different units, if you will, and these are the microsporangia. So here kind of opened up here, and here, these are the microsporangia. And once again, a microsporangia, just like a megasporangium, these are structures that are ultimately going to produce spores. So inside the anther, so inside these microsporangia in the anther, there are these specialized cells called microspores that are produced by meiosis. And ultimately, they are going to develop into pollen grains. And so each of these little kind of circles here is referring to a pollen grain. We're going to talk about more details as to how this pollen grain is formed, and then how pollination occurs, and then how fertilization occurs in some other videos. But I do want to point out that these pollen grains are the male gametophytes. Remember, the gametophytes are just the structures that make up the gametophyte generation in this alternation of generations. So the flower as a whole is a sporophyte, and then these pollen grains are the gametophytes. This slide just puts all of the kind of images together from the previous couple slides with the labels in place just for reference. This is also found in your OpenStax textbook if you want to refer back to this. This is figure 26.14 in the OpenStax Biology 2nd edition.